Wonderful to see all of you again in this space. Again, my name is Karen Carboner. I'm a Whitman scholar at NYU. I also head an organization called the Walt Whitman Initiative. We do a lot of public-facing poetry events. And I was a co-curator with Susan Tane, who's one of the donors on an exhibition called, look at me, I'm so nervous that I'm forgetting the exhibition title. Yes, New York, Poet of the Body, New York's Walt Whitman. And just a few things. We are being taped. This is going to be on the Wilson Institute YouTube, so if you'd like to see it again, please do. I'm very sorry to say that Susan Tane is ill. She's very sorry that she's ill. We planned this event for a very long time to honor her and Susan Zeiger. Very happy to have Susan Zeiger with us. Susan, can we give you a little round of applause here? Thank you so much. The whole event really is to honor two incredibly generous and wonderful gestures to Brooklyn College, and not just to Brooklyn College, right, but to Whitman Studies, to the world of poetry. Giving two very valuable books to a public university like this opens them up to the world. So we have to thank the two Susans for that sort of generosity. It's not very typical of the collecting world, as many of you know, and hopefully this will make Brooklyn College really a new destination for Whitman studies and for poetry lovers everywhere. So what I would like to do today is tell you a little bit about the two books and also the two paintings that you've just seen that are hanging in special collections, kind of tying together all of these remarkable things that are here. And then also talking a little bit about Susan Zeiger and Susan Tane's gifts and their provenance. I invite questions, so please, informal, quiet, easy time. I hope you have a good time, and I can save some time at the end for discussion. We have a reception afterwards that I hope you will join us for as well. But thank you so much for coming. All right, let's see if I can get the hang of this. And the first thing I wanted to open up with, I guess, is explaining I have this odd title for the presentation. I actually thought it would catch people's eyes, right? Like Walt Whitman, a Brooklyn college boy. Walt Whitman, when his book did not sell, wrote his own reviews. And one of his most famous is Walt Whitman, a Brooklyn boy. And I put up a piece of it here. He actually republished this review several times. So the first edition of Leaves of Grass came out in July 1855. By September, sales are really lagging. Nobody knows what this book is about or what it's supposed to do. So Walt starts writing these reviews. And I have to read you a little bit of it. It's kind of funny because he obviously must realize that people haven't figured out that he's writing the review. They're highly personal. Other poets celebrate great events, personages, romances, wars, loves, passions, the victory and power of their country, or some real or imagined incident, and polish their work and come to conclusions and satisfy the reader. This poet celebrates himself, and that is the way he celebrates all. His work, his life, manners, friendships, writings, all have among their leading purposes an evident purpose, as strong and avowed as any of the rest, to stamp a new type of character, namely his own, and indelibly fix it and publish it, not for a model, but an illustration for the present and future of American letters and American young men. Okay, and so he's really thinking, he's inventing poetry, right? He's inventing an American idea of a poet. And these are the instructions, just briefly. First, be yourself, what you would show in your poem. Such seems to be this man's example, an inferred rebuke to the schools of poets. He makes no allusions to books or writers. Their spirits do not seem to have touched him. He has not a word to say for or against them, or their theories or ways. He never offers others. What he continually offers is the man whom our Brooklynites know so well. So for Whitman, first and foremost, that perennial question of American literary history, how does a grammar school dropout, the son of a farmer turned carpenter, how does he become America's greatest poet? One great answer is Brooklyn, right? Brooklyn really fed him. And I'm going to show you a few ways that that happened. First, I have to show you a little bit of Long Island. And that girl back there is that baby. This is the house that Whitman actually was born in on Long Island in West Hills. So he was born to a rural setting. But around age 4, his father was very antsy to get back into the city. I'm showing you a few details about the house because Whitman Sr., even though he was born into farming, was an excellent carpenter. He built that house, and there's all sorts of features in the house that show just how finessed a worker he was. And I believe, like many, that somehow that finesse at doing something very physical got into Whitman doing this incredible book with such finesse, right, even though he was not trained. So when he first came to Brooklyn, I know this doesn't look like the Brooklyn many of you know, but this is what Brooklyn Heights actually looked like for Walt when he got there in 1823. This is from a very famous painting that maybe some of you recognize from the Brooklyn Museum of Art. And I love it because even though the painting is not quite as big as the screen, it is a walk-in painting. And you get an image maybe of not skyscrapers and, crowded streets, but a lot of really amazing energy that is brewing. So as far as numbers go, Brooklyn was expanding so quickly. Just as an example, when Whitman moved to Brooklyn, there were about 8,000 people. It was a village at that time in 1823. In about 13 years or so, 1835, that's the year it becomes a city, and it grew to 24,310 people. 1860, jumping it up forward a little bit more, 256,714 Brooklynites lived in the city. Does anyone know how many people live in Brooklyn right now?
2.4 million.
Yeah, it's like, I think at the last count, like 2.6, around that. So a tremendous growth, right? And Whitman and his family were part of this idea of this incredible space expanding. And here is, I've made this map of Whitman's different residences. He lived in over 30 residences total in New York. And one of the reasons for this is his father was a very erratic worker, probably an alcoholic, and he would buy a piece of property and fix it up or build it, and then he would move on. So Whitman did not know a steady life until he finally bought his own house in Camden when he was much older, in his 50s. So it gives you an idea, and I numbered it so that you can see, especially for the Brooklynites who live here, early on he's up in Brooklyn Heights, right, in what is now Dumbo, but the family gradually moves further to cheaper properties out east as the father really deteriorates. I couldn't help plugging this, and I know some of you are smiling, but for a very long time we have been trying to save the one extant Whitman residence that's still, there it's, I think it's back, that's still, available and still actually a lived-in property, not far from here in Clinton Hill at 99 Ryerson Street. That's the building in the middle. There was a third story put on in the late 19th century. And the artist who maybe some of you know, Robert Andrew Parker, who's a great American artist, still alive in his 90s, still producing beautiful art. He did this wonderful sketch of what Ryerson must have looked like during the time that Whitman lived in it. The house is not protected, and the neighborhood is swiftly gentrifying. So for a long time, there's been a movement to try to preserve this house in some way or another. If you are interested in this, I'm always willing to talk about it. I've actually been inside the house just to give you a taste of what life in Brooklyn was like for Whitman. And those are my students and I on the right, in the hallway where Ralph Waldo Emerson came in there to greet Whitman. And this is possibly the room where Whitman finished Leaves of Grass. just really beautiful wide floorboards, typical of the late 19th century. So as far as Brooklyn goes, Whitman was here, right? He completed the first edition of Leaves of Grass here, the second, the third. Brooklyn is really the home base for Whitman's products. And one of the reasons, or here's several of the reasons why Brooklyn was the perfect place. When he was growing up in Brooklyn Heights, the Brooklyn Apprentices Library just opened up. And this was a free library. If you were an apprentice, your boss could get you a library card, and there were a lot of books. There was a museum exhibition. And for a kid who had just a Bible on the shelf of his regular home, it was a real amazing treat and blessing. So Whitman became actually quite active in the Brooklyn Apprentices Library. On the right-hand side, you see a note from 1835 where he signs off as acting librarian. So very important to him, the idea of a free library. And if you think about it, that's the nature of Brooklyn, right? There was a real philanthropic streak in Brooklyn at the time that enabled someone as poor and sort of out of the way as Whitman to actually make it. He dropped out of school at age 12. He had to do that. It's a family of 8, very big, dysfunctional family. And as the second son, he was financially responsible for a lot of what went on. So I love this image. Susan and I found this when we were searching for things for our exhibition. And it's a rare image of Whitman without a beard. Oh my God. You know, the great bearded poet. But here he's quite young and he's setting type possibly for the Democratic Review or any of the number of newspapers that he worked for, both in Brooklyn and downtown Manhattan. He later became the editor of the Brooklyn Daily Eagle, which still is a great newspaper here in Brooklyn. So Whitman did a lot of editing, some reporting, and then closer to the time when he would get Leaves of Grass together, his father was weakening as a carpenter, quite ill, and so Whitman and his favorite brother Jeff took over the house building business. And what you have here, we had this on exhibition in the Grolier Club, and it was just amazing to see it in person. But these are Whitman's carpentry notes on how to build a house. It's actually how to build actual houses. Now they're knocked down, but they were on Cumberland Avenue, if you all know where that is. And when you read the notes, if anybody knows anything about carpentry, they're actually quite good. So I don't know how many poets can claim this, but here is a poet a lot of people call the Bard of Democracy, America's poet, but he was also capable of building a house.
Like his dad.
Like his dad. And a little bit on philanthropic Brooklyn, because this is the environment that Whitman is growing up in. And I know some of you are from Brooklyn Heights and might know about the Brooklyn Women's Exchange. It's still there on Pierpont, but it started around Whitman's time, and it was a place where women could train to have an actual profession, right? To not just suffer if they were left alone with children or just trying to make a living for themselves. So an example of some of the ways that Brooklyn and Brooklynites were trying to make it easy for even people who were challenged. And this is the interior of the Plymouth Church of the Pilgrims, and Whitman was not a churchgoer. He dabbled, he went here and there, he went to synagogues, he went to a couple of temples. I think that's just the nature of his poetry. But he did show up a couple of times to hear Henry Ward Beecher, who was just a monumental figure of the time. And it's a treat to go into this church. I don't know if anyone has done it, but they have secular windows. You're sitting in this really beautiful, lofty space, and you look and you're like, wait, that's the founding of Harvard University over there. That's not Jesus. So it still has sort of like an edgy flavor to it. And maybe my favorite part is underneath, because the Plymouth Church of the Pilgrims served as a huge depot for the Underground Railroad, and the church workers now there often are very kind and actually let you go downstairs, and it's quite moving to be there where so many people seeking their freedom, wound up sleeping temporarily on their way up north to Canada. So something to keep in mind when you're next in the Heights. And here we go, like we've been talking about preparations, and then around 1855, after lots of adventures in Brooklyn, a little bit of a stay in New Orleans, which is very storied. Whitman comes back, doesn't really do that much. He's building houses. He's not really on the record. And in 1855 comes out with this book. And it's really just because of his friends, the Rome brothers. They consented to help print the book if Whitman would help set the type. On the left, we've just looked at this in special collections. Again, on the right, if you missed our talk about this very unusual combination of title page and frontispiece, again, no author's name anywhere. All you've got is that image of someone who's a working class Brooklynite, sexualized, right? Arms akimbo, and a couple of really interesting details that I promised to talk to you about. Number one, that image, we think still, was taken by a very eccentric photographer who was also an actor. He's the guy in the top hat named Gabriel Harrison. Harrison had a very strange and storied New York career doing all sorts of things, but he was a particularly interesting photographer, which might account for some of the character of Whitman's shot. And in the middle of this is Samuel Hollier, who became quite a famous engraver. He's the person who actually enabled that daguerreotype to be printed into the book, right? So he took the daguerreotype and actually made a steel engraving that is now American history. And I did promise this to the folks that were sitting in the room there. The engraving is highly unusual, right? Because it's almost a full body shot. And most of the engravings at the time, if you had a frontispiece at all in your book, shoulders on up, right? Emphasis on the head and the mind. Whitman put a huge emphasis on the lower part. And as I said, very, very cool that he had shading done by Hollier that made him look like he was emanating from the page rather than just on it. And we have notes that show that he was quite unhappy with the flatness of the crotch. So you can't get more sex, drugs, and rock and roll than this. He actually had his crotch amplified. I can't make stuff like this up by Samuel Hollier through time. So as I told you, we can kind of date the different copies of Leaves of Grass based on whether or not the crotch is enhanced, as we say. So I wanted to highlight how unusual this book is, and I hope that Susan Taine's book is something that lures you back to Brooklyn College, to the archive, so you take a look at the book on your own. We have it again on the left-hand side here in a very typical combo title page frontispiece on the right of Longfellow's works, and all those things that I told you, you know, the typical askance look, the tie. He looks prestigious, right? He looks like a poet, and the idea of poetry, as Whitman is really beginning this, is something that has like a higher art to it. Longfellow went to Bowdoin, Emerson went to Harvard. A lot of them were college grads and had a lot of money or married into money. Whitman had nothing, right? He really did not come from money at all. And you can see that his whole modus here is projecting himself as something that's quite different than what people were used to with poetry. So I think that's part of the reason he left his name off of the book entirely, off of the cover, off of the title page. You just needed to look at this image, and you would see that local Brooklynite that everybody knew so well around here, right? The guy at the docks, the guy taking the ferry, the guy working at the print shop. And that's really the basis of Leaves of Grass. And just a comparison, too, of the typical content, because if you were in special collections, you were lucky enough to see those beautiful long lines of Whitman, right? The father of free verse streaming across the page. Walt was helping set the type, so we know it was intentional, that he didn't observe margins in the ways that other people did. This is much more typical, right? And I have some figures here so you can see the differences with how financially people differed from Whitman. Whitman really didn't do well with the first edition of Leaves of Grass, but Longfellow did really well with Hiawatha that same year. And this is what people wanted at the time. On the shores of Gitche Gumee, of the shining Big Sea water, stood Nokomis the old woman, pointing with her finger westward, or the water pointing westward to the purple clouds of sunset. You could not get more opposite of Song of Myself than that, right? And it even imitates a European model, the Finnish Kalevala, in its patterning. So it was looking over its shoulder at the old world, which is something that Whitman really didn't want to do. And it was also very confined, right? Seeing also Native Americans through a certain light as well. When I teach this section, I always bring up Whitman's section of the forced marriage of the red girl and the trapper who's holding her hand really tightly, right? Whitman is intentionally showing discomfort in that relationship. Longfellow was showing a very glossed over vision of Native American culture. So moving forward from 1855, Whitman started really favoring going to New York City to hang out. And one of the reasons was there was a bar there called Pfaff's Cellar Saloon. And if you have not heard about it, you've got to check out the Pfaff's website. There's like a huge website about this. It was the first bohemian hangout in the United States. Everybody who was anybody went there. And it was in the heart of the theater district. The building actually still stands very near the corner of Bleecker and Broadway. So if any of you are in the neighborhood, Hans Deli is underneath one side. You can see the building here all the way on the left in the 1860s, right? And Walt may well have been one of the figures out here for the parade. And nowadays, it's a twin tenement, also unprotected from any landmarks. And here you see what it actually looks like inside and out. People love to take photos and also even to paint it. So you can see Nick Buffin, the artist, painted this really fabulous image of the modern day take on Pfaff's. And that image to the right, that's actually Susan Tane right there. I bring students and whoever wants to go, you're quite invited also, the public, down to the cellar of Hans, where they're slicing chicken and broccoli, because it's a deli, and they let us do this, and we go into the room where it could very well be that Whitman wrote some of the Calamus poems that he came out with in 1860. So despite all of the water bottles and the chopped up chicken, it has like an incredible resonance for people who are interested in Bohemian culture. And so when Whitman is hanging out there at Pfaff's, he gets to know an artist called Charles Hine. And here you see a much bigger image of the gorgeous portrait that is hanging up in special collections. Again, some really unusual features to this portrait. The chest hair. I mean, who paints chest hair in the 19th century into a portrait? I guess if you're Walt Whitman's portraitist, you do it. The burnished cheeks, right? The ruddiness of the cheeks, but that whiteness of the forehead. So perhaps a couple of lagers. Charles Pfaff was Swiss, and he brought with him recipes for really good fresh lager. If you're a beer drinker, just FYI, New York was a stout and ale town, of course, right? Because of the British presence. But Germans started coming in around 1849. All the revolutions going on in Europe brought them over, and Swiss and German and Austrian, they brought lager with them, which was a huge, huge thing. Walt loved it. So don't be fooled by this talk of his novel, the temperance novel. Just was like, he was not a temperance activist. So could be those ruddy cheeks, that could be part of it, or just like a really great sunburn. really good-looking guy, right? Like presented himself and actually wound up on newspapers, on covers of newspapers, just because of how he looked. And he was frequenting this bohemian hangout, right? Like hanging out with cross-dressing artists and musicians and composing these incredible poems, right? Poems that we still think of as forward today. They still make my NYU students blush. So that's something incredible. Really a lot about same-sex love, but exploratory on so many different levels. And Whitman used that portrait on the left for the frontispiece image on the right. So I know a lot of you know a lot about Whitman, but just to refresh, Leaves of Grass is the title of his poetry collection throughout his life, right, from 1855 to 1892. And depending on how you count it, he either comes out with 6 or 9 editions, and he's constantly changing it. He is a shape-shifting artist, right, a real fluxus artist. So constantly growing the collection, changing the poems, and also really reconceptualizing what the book looked like. So in 1860, he obviously really loved this painting that Charles did, and he used it with an engraver named Stephen Alonzo Schaff, who wound up working for the Federal Mint, I think. He was quite a famous engraver, but produced this one that goes into the 1860 edition. Notice the chest hair is missing. And that is going to bring me to Susan Zeiger's gift, because Charles Hine and Whitman were obviously very, very close. They wrote a lot of letters, even when they didn't see each other. There was a really tremendous correspondence. And we learn from his wife, Julia, later, that she was his amanuensis. In other words, when Charles was too ill to write for himself, he would dictate letters to his wife to write to Whitman. So sort of vicariously, she was a part of this relationship. So when Charles died in 1871, she continued to write to Whitman because she really felt like she knew him. And I think I have a quote here. I'll read it from my notes, but it's quite moving. She begins this letter. This is written shortly after Charles dies. My dear friend Walt Whitman, I have written so many letters to you dictated by Charles that I feel a painful pleasure in commencing this to you at this time, knowing that his voice is silent and that no pleasant message can come from his lips to you. It is useless for me to tell you how strong his affection was for you and how he has looked forward to you coming to New Haven. I think after your visit to him that his hold on life seemed to give way and his yearnings were all accomplished. It's really quite moving to me, and there's not a lot of writing about Charles Hine and Walt Whitman, but they had a really intense relationship. And she knew it, and she carried it forward. In this same letter, as you can see on the right, she actually asked Whitman for work because she was raising 3 children on her own. Her husband didn't really actually do that well as an artist, so she needed money, and she asked if he knew if she could get a writing gig. It's very, very interesting, right? And her letters are quite well written, so quite possibly Whitman also had a lot in common with Julia. This was her last letter. She wrote extensively, actually, to Whitman. This is the last one that we have, and it's because Whitman died about 3 months later. And I had to show it to you because she was living in Flatbush. I mean, Susan, you have returned her to Flatbush. So it's really amazing. She signs it down there, and I just discovered this in the archive. So something to note about Mrs. Charles Hine. And as you know, if you were in Special Collections a moment ago, that gift of Susan Zeiger's is this copy of the author's edition of Leaves of Grass, signed to Julia from her friend, the author, Walt Whitman, who also signs the title page. These are quite valuable books because Whitman actually signed off on each one of them. And just so that you know, 1876, so we're not really that far from 1855, 21 years, but a lot has changed for Whitman. He was volunteering as a Civil War nurse for about 4 years, didn't do well with that, right? Tended to hundreds of soldiers, but never really felt like his healthy self afterwards. Took on a lot of those illnesses himself. And around this time, he was really pretty destitute. As many of you know, he actually sold these by subscription. So you could buy in advance for $5 a copy of this, and he would sign it off to you. There are a couple of things that make this book very special, and of course one of them is that he signs every title page. The other thing, if you notice, it says author's edition with portraits from life on that title page. So he's starting to develop this idea of the illustrated edition, except the illustrations are Walt. They're not anything else except him. And in this edition that Susan donated, there are the two images. On the left, again, you have the handsome 30-something-year-old Walt Whitman, and then later on, you have the 50-something by William Linton, who was a famous British engraver at the time. He could not get hold of the engraving I showed you before based on the Charles Hine image, so he only included these two in this book, but still kind of interesting in the middle of the poetry to encounter images of Whitman. And that's where I can connect the other portrait hanging up in special collections for you. So George Wellington Waters is better known as a landscape painter, but he was a friend of John Johnston's, and John Johnston was a huge supporter of Whitman. So Johnston asked Waters to paint Walt. And where this all connects is that the 1876 edition came out the same year that Whitman started sitting for this portrait. So completed the next year in 1877. Walt's looking really different, right, from how we've seen him. He aged very, very dramatically, especially after the Civil War. If you have seen images of Lincoln before and after the Civil War, it's the same story. These two men wore that war on themselves. They really dramatically changed their visages. Just another cool note on this is that the reason that Brooklyn College has these two portraits is a professor named John Valente, who was in the English department, it looks like in the early 20th century. And with that, the chief librarian of the time, H.G. Bousfield. Does that ring a bell, Helene, at all?
Marianne might.
Yeah.
Marianne might.
No? Okay, because these two decided to start up something that they called the Walt Whitman Foundation of Brooklyn. And it lasted a surprisingly long period of time, 1947 to 1979. These two decided that Brooklyn College should be the place where all of the Whitman stuff would wind up. And they kept a lot of records, and they tried to pull money together. And somehow they got the money, $1,400 in, I forgot what year now, in the 1949 or around that?
1955.
55, thank you.
Fill the frame campaign, and they made buttons to fill the frame with the Whitman, because it was the anniversary of Leaves of Grass, but we were also opening this Whitman Hall right over here.
Oh, right.
Where the two portraits were installed for about 40 years before we moved here at the beginning of the century.
Oh my goodness! Thank you for letting.
They were just out in the hallway.
Incredible.
Anybody could have taken them.
Yeah, well, they bought them for $1,400 at that time. That was a very good investment, I would say.
Can I say that they were appraised as well before they were purchased, and the appraisal letter is in the files here, and the appraiser said they were of no value.
Wow. Well, those were different times, I assure you. Yeah. I mean, we don't have many color images of Whitman from his time, right? And especially that Charles Hine painting of 1860, to imagine him kind of still in his youth and prime in color that painting, it's the reason that Susan and I came to borrow that painting for our Grolier Club exhibition. There is nothing like it. It's really worth standing in front of that portrait and looking into those eyes. That's the guy who really revolutionized poetry. So thank you so much. Great to hear the backstory of that. So a little bit of research for anyone who's interested. And I myself, when I was looking at my Whitman books at home, I saw John Valente in my copy of Democratic Vistas. So he published a few books as well. So something for the books about Brooklyn College. So I'm just about to end, everyone, and I just wanted to say a few words on the individual books and these wonderful Susans that gave them to Brooklyn College. And Susan was kind enough to share her story of the provenance of the 1876 book. And since she's here and we have an intimate audience, maybe she will answer some questions. But I know from her that her grandfather, Isidore Zeiger, grew up in a crowded household of 8 or 9. It was on Orchard Street? It was on Broome, because I was confused because you said it was next to the Tenement Museum, so I guess I'm flipped around on the other side. So he grew up on the Lower East Side and also really loved going shopping for secondhand books. And for many years in the early 20th century, 4th Avenue, in between Union Square and Astor Place, it was known as Booksellers Row. It was an incredible place to find used books. Actually, the Strand is like the outpost, right? That's I think the only one left of that time. So Susan, I was trying to imagine Isidore, and there he is, looking through the books at Weiser's. What a great New York story, right? Belonged to Mrs. Charles Hine, Julia Hine. We don't know what happened to the book after that, but sometime then later, your grandfather wound up finding it on some bookstall, and now here it is, a New York treasure. What a great, great story. Now, as far as Susan Taine's donation, you would think that I would have a big story for you because it's the first edition of Leaves of Grass. I don't. When we bought it for Sotheby's for the Whitman exhibition, it didn't have any provenance. It just said, from a gentleman, which Sotheby's and other auction houses do when they want to keep private whoever is selling the book. So that edition, as pristine and beautiful, first edition, first issue, gorgeous to look at. I can't offer you a story about it, but I can tell you a little bit about the most current owner of it, who gave it to Brooklyn College. And here you see Susan, and I just wanted to depict her in action because she's a very untypical book collector. She actually really loves literature, and she wants to know more. She's an explorer, as you all know who know her. So on the left, she decided in 2019 she would take my Whitman in New York class at Columbia. And when I asked the students to bake graham bread, which is the first health bread ever invented in the United States, and Walt was very involved in health. Maybe some of you know the recently found Manly Health and Training Manual that Whitman wrote serially for the New York Daily Graphic. So Whitman was really thinking about these things. So Susan actually baked graham bread, and all the students got to sample the graham bread. So I had to include that. You see her also up there on a tour at the Brooklyn Ferry Landing, and we're standing there with Julie Carlson, who helps her with her collection. And we're at the AIDS Memorial. So if you have not seen that, near St. Vincent's Triangle in Manhattan, it's a long time coming, the AIDS Memorial, and Jenny Holzer has designed a beautiful word sculpture of Song of Myself. That's the words underneath our feet, that's Walt Whitman. So a really great sort of center for Whitmanites. And just showing a few photos of our time as we were getting the exhibition together. It took us 3 years to assemble the Grolier Club exhibition. This is us very early on, and maybe some of you recognize the Camden Whitman House. And there's the painting. right? But at the Grolier Club, surrounded by other goodies that we had found, and the space of the Grolier up above. So I just wanted to send out a tribute to Susan, it's been an incredible adventure to know her, and her generosity, like Susan Zeiger's, it's just shown so beautifully by what brings us together today. So on that note, thank you so much from all of us to both Susans, and I say another round of applause for them. So if there are any questions or comments or additions, happy to hear them, and if not, we can go over to the food.
What about the period at the end of Leaves of Grass?
You are the second person to ask today. So, well, I think it's a great visual, right? It really adds oomph to the title. And it was kind of a typical 19th century move to do that, to use the periods that way. Whitman, on the tops of each page of the first edition, it says Leaves of Grass, period, Leaves of Grass, period. So there's a sort of finality to it, an energy to it. And I think I mentioned to others that he loved periods. When he wrote an ellipses into Leaves of Grass, it would go from 2 dots to 7 dots, depending on how long he wanted you to stop. So he often thought about unusual uses of punctuation. Thanks, Bob. Anything else? Yes, Douglas.
Do you see after Whitman publishes the Socrates image, do you see other poets imitating that kind of, like how influential, obviously
Such a good question.
Poetry is influential. Is that image influential?
That's such a good question. I remember doing research on it, and prior to Whitman, there were a few authors that did it. Lord Byron did it. Maybe that's predictable. And there was someone else. It's very rare to see them.
You mean the whole body?
Yeah, it's worth an article, right? Somebody writing about this, but you rarely see the whole person. It even feels weird, right, to think about seeing an entire body. Let's just put him up here again.
I just asked because, for example, like Milton had long hair, and when John Milton became popular, all these 18th century male poets cultivated long hair,
funny.
And then would depict themselves looking like Milton.
Right.
I wondered if, people take,
I don't
look like Whitman.
Well, the beard, for sure. Do you all know that there are Whitman beard contests to this day? Because he really mastered the idea of sort of the poet beard. So you do see a lot of imitation of that. And I feel like, in many ways, his outfit here set the pace for what an American uniform would look like, right? It doesn't look that different from what you'll see if you leave this auditorium and go outside, right? A very typical outfit, and that was not typical of the time. It's a good question about frontispieces, though. I don't know how long the trend to put the frontispiece in books lasted after this, because certainly we don't do it anymore, right? It would look odd. But if anybody has anything to add to that, Susan, yeah.
I so much appreciate your talk. Thank you, Karen. It's wonderful to be placed, have been placed in his Brooklyn and your context, and such a joy to hear that. I just can't resist this synergy or this parallelism. So my grandfather Isidore came as a young child. My brother knows the story better than I do, but they were Polish, poverty-stricken Polish immigrants and Jewish Polish immigrants, and lived on the Lower East Side. And he loved school when he started school as a child, but got out of school at 11 to working because the family needed the money. His mother had died, and his father was not succeeded and took care of the family very well. So he started working as a messenger boy and doing all kinds of sort of work that child workers do in the early 20th century. But anyway, he had such a yearning to learn, and he was working so hard and long for education. And so we heard that he was an autodidact, and he started going to the Settlement House Library at night to read, and so that wonderful.
Oh my goodness!
The parallel, and also eight or nine children, and that's his family. So that's how he became a pharmacist. He took the high school, high school test. He took tests. He was self-taught, and then was able to go on and get an education, and eventually had a pharmacy in Manhattan. So this was.
Did you know him?
No, he died. My mom was pregnant. He died. Not my brother, but older. I didn't know him. But I feel like I do know. He wrote long, and a lot of the books, the less valuable books he would often write long notes in the handwritten sentences on the pages of them, where he bought the book and why he bought it and what he liked about it.
What an amazing story. The book clearly belongs here, right? And he headed for the right poet. It sounds like they shared quite a bit. That's very moving. I forgot to include that. That was really the motivation with Brooklyn College, right?
That and the
right, exactly. Yeah. Thank you so much. My goodness. John?
You had talked about several residences of his in Brooklyn, one in West Hills. I was just wondering, Camden seemed to stick out a little bit. What brought him down to Camden, New Jersey?
That's a great question. So, till 1862, he's totally a New Yorker. And then he knows about the war and he can't resist. He's past the draft age, but he wants to go down there. So he leaves everything. He also hears a rumor that his brother is wounded. He tries to find his brother. And he stays in D.C. through the war and after. He actually has his only really serious relationship down there with Pete Doyle, who's an Irish cab driver. And his mother winds up moving in with his brother, George Washington Whitman, Camden, New Jersey. And I've always tried to figure that one out, but I think Camden is kind of like Brooklyn in that it's across from Philadelphia. There's sort of the energy of sort of the sister city, but you're at the less fancy side. And Whitman went up to visit his mother in Camden. She died there. And he became so ill, this is the early 1870s, that he then moved in with his brother into the room that his mother had been living in, if you want to hear something a little creepy. But yeah, he adored his mother, so that sort of broke him apart. And he wound up living there. And then there was a move to raise money for him, and folks raised enough money that he could buy his own house, and he chose to live in Camden. So he never really, occasionally for a visit, but he never really came back to Brooklyn. He actually had his parents exhumed because they were originally buried here in Brooklyn, but he had the bodies brought down to Harley Cemetery in Camden. Yeah, he's a serious New Jersey person at the end.
Thank you.
Sure, thank you. Yes, please.
Does the war become integrated into later editions of Leaves of Grass? And how does it seems like that rupture seems so contrary in some ways to the early
Oh my gosh.
brightness and optimism, and I hope he managed.
Such a smart question. It changed him entirely. I think the sort of joyous, kind of sexy cruiser that he was in the city just changed dramatically as soon as he started seeing piles of amputated limbs. And he became a Civil War nurse and actually tried to help put people back together. And quite famously, maybe you all know this, he wrote notebook after notebook noting the soldiers that he was nursing and what he would bring them. He worked as a clerk during the day and would go to the hospital tents at night and take these notes. So the outcome of all of this, he wrote a few things. He wrote a booklet called Drum Taps, which for a lot of people is just a collection of war poetry that's unparalleled. not about the front line and not about victories and glory, but about the wound dresser, right? Its most famous poem, or that side of the war that people who are serving see. So it's funny you ask if it's integrated. And Susan, you might have noticed about the 1876 that it feels shifted, right? A lot of the pages are loose. Whitman actually tried over and over again to figure out how he would fit the war into his greater project. So he started putting drum taps into Leaves of Grass. And he would sometimes actually physically unbind and then bind them again. But he was really trying to figure out telling the story of America through these poems. So a lot of that fragility of your book, some of it has to do with the pulp paper, which is much more fragile than the rag content of the 1855. But it's also because Whitman is constantly thinking about how the war is going to play a part in the story of America. He tried to publish his book Memoranda during the war, so he kept notes on all of his service, like visiting soldiers and what he did, and nobody wanted to publish it after the war. It reminds me of like right after COVID, nobody wanted a book about COVID. Like we just wanted to move away from COVID, as quickly as we could. And that's, I think, what he felt. So Memoranda got published about 10 years after that, in 1876, as opposed to 66. So it, hit him very hard. And his body too, right? I think a lot of how we conceptualize the good, great poet is that wounded man of later years. Yeah, thank you.
Well, I just had one thing or two things to add. The painting by Heine actually appears in the movie Can You Ever Believe?
No way! Oh my gosh.
Lee Israel, who was a class of 1960 graduate. And Melissa McCarthy filmed it. Were you there? Yeah. She filmed it over there in
My office is the dressing room.
Wow.
I guess they loved the painting and they stuck it, because it's not where it usually is. They just sort of stuck it in the shop. So you see the movie. There she is.
Did they allude to it at all, or it was just in the background?
Lee Israel would have been a student during the fundraising for Fill the Frame.
So great. Okay, thank you. Anand, did you have a question?
Just wondering, was there any threat from one whom, basically, used to edit his work, or to whom used read out his particular snippets, or
I love this question because it ties in with what I'm working on right now. I'm writing a new biography of Whitman. My first chapter is on his mother, who has consistently been downplayed or denounced as illiterate. Whitman himself kind of helped promote that. He said she was illiterate in the formal sense. And a lot of critics through time rolled with that. In the 50s and 60s, there was a movement to demonize her because she was the reason her son was gay, right? So Louisa became actually hated by major critics like Edwin Miller, who edited all of his correspondence. But, he blamed her on Whitman Sr.'s alcoholism. So, but she read his poetry. And when they were separated, because when he went down to the war, she was still in Brooklyn. They had his most lengthy correspondence was with his mother. So this woman who has been denounced as illiterate read his poetry and gave him maybe not the most sophisticated feedback, but if you guys have a parent like this, who's maybe more salt of the earth as I did, you really respect that sort of feedback, right? Maybe not the most literate feedback, but heartfelt feedback. So, but he very much cultivated this image of himself operating on his own, right? It's a whole mythology of origins that we've got with Whitman, and that's part of the difficulty of writing his biography, because it's very easy to buy into it. But it's a brilliant question. I know his mother read his work, and maybe his favorite brother, Jeff. But he didn't really have a coterie, a clique. He was a loner at a time when there were a lot of artistic groups. It's a really good question. Thank you. Yes, please.
A question about how that first edition doesn't feature his name. Occasion edition. And I just wonder, about why he started to do that, practical decision, money, or how that may ties into the war and mentality. Just wondering why he started to name up. Because it feels such a distinct decision being off.
Such a cool decision, right? Like if you're a nobody, and maybe some Brooklynites knew him as that person, right? But the world didn't know who this was. How can you make yourself intriguing? Leave the name off, right? They just have to judge you by the image. So I feel like, especially for the first edition, this was brilliant. He made a lot of brilliant decisions. Reviewing himself, brilliant, right? He also did things like, he actually came out with a pamphlet of reviews that he would distribute for free. It's called Leaves of Grass Imprints. And they included the worst reviews, by the way, because there's no such thing as bad publicity, right? If somebody's taking the time to write, like, that, what did they accuse? They said, not only should he should die at the executioner's whip, which always shocks me because I'm like, the executioner also has a whip? It's not bad enough to just be put to death. You want to be whipped by the executioner? They really, really hassled him, and he promoted all of that. He was very happy to share that with people. I think later when people knew it was him, he couldn't play with it as much, right? And then to make extra money, I think it's kind of brilliant to sign every copy, right? Because he could charge $5 in 1876 because people knew that they were getting, even though he was like still a nobody, he was still signing it. So just some smart business decisions. When we did the exhibition, we went down to DC, and there's a whole file on Whitman's copyrights. He controlled all aspects of book production. It's crazy, because these days authors, you just like send it off, and there it is, like on the page. Whitman made sure it looked a certain way, actually controlled the copyrights, wrote to the Copyright Office when the copyrights were expiring. It is a way of thinking about books that expired in the 19th century, but he very much controlled all aspects of book production. These are such good questions. You guys are exercising my Whitman muscles. Yes, please.
I don't know if you addressed this because I came a little late, but is there anybody who wrote anything like the way he wrote before him in the free verse and those bold, statements? Were there other people who wrote like
that is the brilliant question, right? If there is, we don't know who it is. I can think of the things that he would read, like John Milton's Paradise Lost. It doesn't exactly rhyme, and it's very powerful. So there were cutting-edge thinkers before him, but I think as far as really letting loose, and a lot of that poetry, as I said, still embarrasses people, right? He's got a poem, Spontaneous Me, that praises masturbation. Like, who does that? In 1855, and also his expression of same-sex desire in Calamus and Live Oak with Moss, unparalleled, so nervy, really out there. Maybe it's just that loose cannon of an upbringing not expecting to make it, right? Having an alcoholic dad, having to deal with a huge family, a messy family, and just putting all your money into your own project. And he got lucky.
Somehow that picture of him there, it almost looks like he's challenging the reader. Like,
yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, this is my book. What are you going to do about it?
Right. Especially the posturing of the arms.
Yeah.
I feel like conveys that. Yeah. It's true. And the hat on. In the preface, which I said some of it in the room over there, he says also, take off your hat to nothing known, unknown, or to any man or number of men. He makes good on it right here, right? Not even in the frontispiece is he going to take his hat off for you. Well, thank you, everyone. That was fun for me, too. Thank you, Susan.
staff that you sent in, on the calendar sheet, so we could share those benefactors. All right.
Take care of that. You don't need
What's that?
anything more. You don't need anything.
All done. Thank you. No, everything worked perfectly.
Lovely.
Oh, such good questions. My God.
Yeah, the scholars